Hello and welcome to GottHold's video. My name is Fabian, aka nice to meet. Actually, GottHold's mic is broken, so I'm going to take over and guide you through the lost tips of heli piloting and gunning. Please note that this video is aimed towards mediocre pub pilots, so if you're looking for a video that only explains the very basic controls or stuff like that for the helicopters, then this video is maybe not for you. But if you're looking for more advanced strategies or techniques that allow you to compete with higher skilled players, then this video is for you. First of all, let's talk about how to defend yourself in the helicopter when a jet is attacking you from above. Oftentimes you will only encounter mediocre or simply bad jet pilots in public servers, and those usually can be countered quite easily by putting the nose of the Viper right on target to give your gunner a lined up TV shot, or by pulling up the nose appropriately for the Havoc to give your gunner a TV shot as well. But then you might be unlucky and encounter better jet pilots, just as the evil Nightwing, as you can see here, who will always try to kill you from a 90-degree angle. Against attacks like that, it is not advisable to use a TV missile. The reason for that is quite simple. If he's engaging you from a high angle like that, you as a helicopter pilot would have to pull up the nose so much that you would lose too much altitude. If you're just using the helicopter's 30mm gun, you don't have to pull up the nose as much and you don't run the risk of crashing the heli into the ground. Furthermore, the TV missile is a what I would like to call 100% weapon. This means it either kills or it doesn't do anything. This is another reason of why not to use a TV missile to defend yourself against the jet that comes to attack you from above. If the TV missile dusts on the target or you simply miss, then you've wasted all your time that you had to engage the enemy jet and at least damage him, so you could disable him on the second pass. But using the TV missile will only waste the time that you had to defend yourself against the incoming jet. Sometimes you might be in the unlucky situation where you don't have enough HP to safely land the helicopter. This might happen when you've been engaged by a jet or your gunner already had to use his extinguisher. Well, here's a method that shows you how to at least partly repair the helicopter mid-air, so you could then later on safely land it and fully repair it. This basically works like an air switch that you hopefully all know how to perform. You simply get out of the helicopter, turn around, and then use the time window that you have to partly repair the helicopter. You usually get between 3 and 5% repaired when you turn around with the torch in your hand, and then when you've done that a couple of times, you should have enough time to get the heli on the ground. Just don't try to overdo it. Do not try to fully repair the helicopter while you're in the air. You will always run the slight risk of failing your air switch, which would then lead to the helicopter standing in the air in its disabled state, and therefore it would either get destroyed in the air or when it hits the ground. So yeah, this method is to be regarded as a last resort only. It should only be used when you really don't have enough time to land the helicopter. As a small tip towards the end, take a look at the thrust meter on the upper right corner of your cockpit. If you want to increase the time window that you have to repair the helicopter, you should have the triangular thrust indicator between the neutral hover state and the climbing state. This will make you exit the vehicle right next to the cockpit and therefore give you more time to perform this mid-air hotfix. In my opinion, every heli pilot should use air radar. That is simply because the biggest threat on the battlefield are enemy jets. And to effectively defend yourself against them or to have an early warning system, air radar is the most useful tool that you have at your disposal. The only disadvantage that you have to deal with when you're using air radar is that you cannot zoom in and out of the map, or that you lose track of targets that either fly below radar or that are using the ECM jammer. Of course, this only works if the targets are not using silenced weapons or if they're 3D spotted all the time. Therefore, in my opinion, the air radar is more effective as an early warning tool than the simple minimap. To overcome the disadvantage of not being able to see ground targets on a minimap, simply press escape. you will have a mini-map that shows the entire map that you're playing on, showing you ground targets, tanks, whatnot. Wherever your help from the air is required, you will be able to see it even though you're running air radar. In contrast to the seat switching maneuver in the Viper, which as you all know is pretty easy to perform, the seat switch in the Havoc is a lot harder to pull off. So here we are going to show you a method that reliably works even for the Russian helicopter. First of all, it's the pilot's job to press the W key until the thrust indicator hits its maximum. You can see that in the upper right corner of your cockpit. And once the pilot hits that specific spot, he has to jump out and switch to the gunner seat. Meanwhile, the gunner is constantly pressing the S key while he's tapping the F1 key. If it wasn't for the gunner pressing the S key all the time, the pilot would exit the vehicle at a point where he wouldn't be able to get in it again. And then again in the replay, keep pressing the W key until the indicator hits its maximum. And in the gunner seat, keep pressing S and switch seats. Furthermore, you should try to stand as still in the air as you possibly can with the Havoc if you do not want to fail your seat switch. You can see that here with the magnified air radar and speed meter. As soon as you start moving sideways or towards the front, the pilot would most likely exit the vehicle where he wouldn't be able to get in the cockpit again. Moving backwards a tiny bit with the Russian helicopter isn't that big of a deal, but as I said, when you try to pull off the seat switch in it, try to stand as still as you can and you should have the least amount of problems. When engaging in enemy anti-air, you should know about the different ranges of all the weapon systems. As you can see here in the background, the range of the helicopter's 30mm gun exceeds the range of the main gun of the anti-airs that applies to the LAV and the Tunguska by roughly 100 meters. The range of the TV missile slightly stays behind the anti-air's main guns, whereas the helicopter pilot's rocket pods have an infinite range and therefore can shoot over the entire map. And here you can now see how to effectively use your range advantage. The enemy anti-air is in roughly 1080 meters distance to the helicopter. You can see that the shots of the anti-air are not hitting the helicopter. The tracers are just disappearing in front of him. But you can also see that the 30mm gun is scoring hit markers on the AA. Therefore, the helicopter can effectively damage the AA without taking damage himself. The same thing also applies to the stationary anti-air guns. As you can see here, the shots of the helicopter are landing right next to the Panzer, whereas the shots of the AA gun are not reaching the helicopter. Therefore, it's safe to assume that you have a range advantage of roughly 100 meters when comparing the helicopter's 30mm gun to a stationary AA gun. Some of you have maybe already seen a pilot that pulled off a looping with his helicopter. Others did it before themselves, but since most pilots do not know how this exactly works, we will show you. Even though it's basically pointless and does not give you any sort of tactical advantage. To start off, the first thing that you need is a certain altitude over the ground. 700 to 800 meters can be regarded as an absolute minimum, otherwise you will end up not being able to complete the looping and will most likely crash your helicopter. After gaining some altitude again, we are ready to do our second looping here. So to begin with, we have to accelerate the heli, so nose down and pull up. After you reach like roughly 40 degrees, you will feel a barrier, so pull in the other direction, and once you reach minus 15 degrees, you have to pull up again, and there you go. Water looping. Something to be proud of. Tell your grandchildren, MLG Pro. So good. Sadly, the technique of the backflip cannot be transferred to a front flip, because whenever you rotate your helicopter by 180 degrees with your rotor blades facing towards the ground, the helicopter will randomly explode. Thank you, DICE. The next tip is about a very basic heli versus heli tactic. Two helicopters are meeting each other and start shooting TV missiles, which they can then dodge by either going upwards or downwards. Now, try to shoot your TV missile in a way that it forces the enemy helicopter pilot to always dodge it by going down. If your gunner does that continuously, forcing the enemy helicopter to lose altitude all the time with each dodge, you as a helicopter pilot are in the comfortable situation to slowly build up a height advantage over the enemy helicopter. This will pretty soon lead to a situation where you are able to put yourself on top of the enemy helicopter, allowing your gunner to kill the enemy with his 30mm gun with no problem. Moreover, putting yourself on top of the enemy helicopter leads to the enemy helicopter not being able to effectively shoot back at you anymore. For example, if the enemy helicopter pilot was about to give his gunner a TV shot, he would have to pull up the nose so much that he would still keep losing altitude and maybe even crash his helicopter. And the same thing, of course, applies to the use of heat-seeking missiles. In order to get a full lock-on, the enemy heli pilot would have to pull up the nose of his helicopter for several seconds, which then would inevitably lead to him crashing his heli into the ground.
I got it! Okie dokie!
Since the question regarding the mouse setup for the gunner occurs relatively often, here you go now, full length, all the details, but first of all, that is the mouse that GottHold is using, the Steel Series Sensei. To be able to also control the TV missile with the keyboard, you can here see the battlefield setup, showing you the arrow keys being bound to the look up and look down and so on directions. So let's assume you'd have to fly a really wide curve with the TV missile and you're already using the full width of your mouse pad. You can then use your arrow keys to continue the movement of the TV missile while you're replacing your mouse on the pad. And now let's take a look at the battlefield internal settings. The mouse sensitivity is set to roughly 25 to 30%. Also make sure that the raw mouse input is deactivated. Looking at the Steel Series software for the Sensei mouse, you can here see two different sensitivity setups. Those can be swapped in the game by a simple press of a mouse button. One setup is using a low sensitivity. That's the one that you use for the 30mm main gun of the heli. And the other one is using a very high sensitivity, which you of course use for the steering of the TV missile. Furthermore, you should make sure that in the Windows internal setup, mouse acceleration is deactivated. The cursor speed, this is kind of a personal preference, is set to 7 out of 11. In the end, you should also take a look at Origin, where you can find the option Activate Origin in-game. This should of course be deactivated. Reason for that is that you could get some additional mouse lag when it's running in the background. Shooting with the TV missile is all about predicting the enemy movements and leading your shots accordingly. In this example, you can see a jet that's firing rocket pods at a ground target. One could now assume that this jet is about to continue to fly in a straight line, so that the rendezvous point would be relatively easy to predict. It would also be thinkable that this jet, after he's fired all his rocket pods, would turn to the left or the right, or maybe even straight up. Because of that, it is very important to not focus on one point of a possible rendezvous only. Since enemy movements sometimes are hard to foresee, keep as many options as possible in the back of your head and try to react accordingly. To finish our starting example, this jet is not flying in a straight line as we assumed in the very beginning, but he's turning left and can be hit from behind like that. The same thing of course applies to helicopters. Try not to focus on one point only, but try to keep as many options as possible when leading your shot on the helicopter. How can you hover correctly without annoying the crap out of your gunner? Sounds easy? Trust me, it's not. Sadly, most pilots have no clue which type of maneuvers have which kind of influence on the gunner perspective, and make it easier or harder for him to hit his target. To show you the exact influence, we've recorded the pilot's and the gunner's perspective and synchronized them so you can see which type of maneuver has which type of influence. As you can see here in the beginning, ruddering to the left or the right does not influence the gunner's perspective at all. You can do that all day, he won't even notice what's happening. Flying forward in a straight line like that, or even flying backwards in a straight line, is not that big of a deal. You can see slight adjustments that are necessary on the gunner's side, but all in all, this maneuver is all right from the gunner's perspective. He is still able to kill ground targets like that. What you can see here now is very problematic. It looks cool and a lot of pilots like to do it, but as you can see, it annoys the crap out of the gunner. It's very hard for him to keep his shots on target. He's not going to be able to effectively snipe infantry or fight off the enemy anti-air or something like that across the map. So to summarize this real quickly, correct hovering does not mean that you have to stand in the air perfectly still. It only means that there are certain maneuvers that should be avoided if possible. As you know, an opponent is displayed on the minimap when he's firing an unsuppressed weapon or firing a shot from a vehicle. If you're using a silenced primary weapon, this is not the case and the minimap stays empty. The same behavior can be transferred to vehicles. Enter a vehicle having a silenced primary weapon equipped, and firing a shot from the vehicle will not have you displayed on the minimap. If this behavior is actually intended by the programmers is unknown to us, but we doubt it. How do you get rid of those annoying gunners that will not leave your helicopter? Besides trying to persuade them, there are also some other forms of, let's say, mild violence that can be used. For example, you have those dangerously looking red gas bottles. Fly into them and ouch. By the way, this maneuver should be performed by the gunner, who then can extinguish the helicopter in case it gets disabled in the process. The same method also works on those green containers, which you can find on almost all Battlefield 3 maps. A little bit more difficult is the so-called watering. This is all about flying the helicopter relatively close to the surface and then ditching it in at the right point so that both the gunner and the heli pilot are thrown out of the vehicle. A third person then standing on the beach has to take the helicopter and get it in the air as quickly as possible. You can also use those pre-programmed fires. This is all about putting the front of the cockpit where the gunner is located inside the fire. The gunner then will automatically take damage over time and in the end will be killed by bad luck. This also works with a small fire. It doesn't have to be the big fire on the Carg Island Road. If you hit the right spot, you can get rid of your gunner over here too. The last method that we can show you here, which sadly is the only one that you have on some of the maps, is to fly relatively close to one of those ships. You really have to pay attention to not to get too close to the ship, because otherwise you would kill yourself in the process. As I said, this method is relatively difficult to pull off simply because the spot that you have to hit is very small, but with a bit of training you can get rid of those annoying gunners, no problem.